In this demonstration, we are going to look at how to maximize net income given some production constraints, some constrained resource. So if we look at our example here, we see that Ace Company makes two products, footballs and baseballs. We have the following information available. We're typically selling 2,000 footballs and 3,000 baseballs for total sales of $60,000 and $25,000 respectively. That level of sales of footballs carries with it variable costs of $24,000, fixed costs of $10,000 for net income of $26,000. Baseballs, on the other hand, generate net income of $6,000 at a production and sales level of 3,000 units. We also know that footballs require 1.25 yards of leather to produce, and baseballs require 1/5 of that amount, or 0.25 yards of leather per unit to produce. We say here assume that Ace is able to order an additional 2,000 yards of leather and wishes to maximize its income. Of the additional units it produces, at least 400 of each product are necessary for sales. How many units of each will be produced given the additional leather supply? So here we want to make sure we focus on the more profitable product. As long as we take into account that we need at least 400 of each product to satisfy some customer demand. So how are we going to determine which product is more profitable? Well, we want to look at the contribution margin per unit and per unit of limited resource. So if we look at the footballs, we see that the contribution margin in total is the $60,000 in sales minus that $24,000 in variable costs, or $36,000. On the other side, baseballs generate total contribution margin of $25,000 in sales minus $13,750 in variable costs, or $11,250. On a per unit basis, footballs are generating that $36,000 in total contribution margin divided by the 2,000 units we're producing, or $18 per unit. And over here, baseballs are generating $11,250 in total contribution margin across 3,000 units, or $3.75 per unit. So on initial glance, the footballs look much more profitable. However, we also need to consider the limited resource, in this case the leather raw material being used to produce these products. So the football again requires 1¼ yards of leather to produce per unit. The baseball requires just 1/4 yard of leather. So we can say that the contribution margin per unit of limited resource of each product can be found as such. That's the contribution margin per unit of product, $18 for the football, divided by the 1¼ yards of leather needed to produce one football, $14.40 per yard. The baseballs, on the other hand, generate much lower contribution margin per unit of product, but require much less of the limited resource to produce. So the baseballs actually produce $15 of contribution margin. Again, this is per yard of leather in this case. So given that information, we want to focus on producing as many baseballs as we can, since they are more profitable when it comes to making use of our limited resource. We were told we had an additional constraint in that we needed to produce at least 400 of each product to satisfy customer demand. So we will make the bare minimum number of footballs 400, and that 400 units of footballs will require the use of 500 yards of leather. So if we had an additional 2,000 yards of leather with which to work, we've used up 500 yards to make footballs. which means we have 1,500 left to make baseballs. That's the 2,000 we had in total, minus the 500 we used up to make footballs. So with those 1,500 yards of leather, I can say, well, 1,500 yards divided by the 0.25 yards of leather necessary to make one baseball means I could make 6,000 baseballs with my extra supply of leather. So again, with this 2,000 total yards of leather, I'm going to produce 400 footballs, the bare minimum, since they are the least profitable product. And I'll have enough left over to make 6,000 baseballs, the more profitable product. Please review any part of this demonstration that you feel necessary. Thank you.